basis, so this is great. So do you want to chat?
Yeah, so you can just down lecture. So the way it will work today is we prefer you back just in just because they don't know how to do it. So basically the way it will work is I'll set questions, I'll ask you the question, and then you can answer those students. Hopefully the whole will take care of somebody at the end of the class. You can just talk about your book and behind you, Eric will be putting up most of the questions, and that's basically it.
Awesome.
And also, sorry?
You want to kind of elaborate on how to do that exactly?
Yeah, I'll explain to you. Yeah, but yeah, if you want to talk to students a bit about yourself as well.
Great. So who was here when I gave the talk a few months ago? A couple of you?
Just because.
Right, okay, so just for everyone, I'll give some context. So, my name is Jed Hearn. I'm a fantasy author. Fires of the Dead is my first novel. Came out only a couple of months ago, so it's still really new and fresh and exciting. I've been writing for about 7 or 8 years and I run a writing advice podcast as well, and I have some other writing resources online and stuff. But yeah, essentially for today, I guess we're just going to run through various frequently asked questions about writing, and I'm sure there'll be like a way for you to ask extra questions as well if they're not already included. Are you ready to?
Yeah. Yep. Just take some time. Okay. Okay. So Jed, first thing I'm going to ask you is, you've written your own book, right? So how did you go about starting with your own book?
Sure. So Fires of the Dead, which is this one here, is the 4th book I've written. First one I've published. So it all started back when I was in, I think year 9 or year 10 at school. One of my friends had just written like a short story over the summer, brought it in. I was really impressed with it, and I didn't want him to like one-up me. So I went away and wrote a whole novel over a year, and I really enjoyed the process. And then I just like kept doing it year after year until I got something that I was pretty happy putting out into the world. So with this one specifically, it is technically a novella, not a novel. So that just means like a shorter version of a book. It's about a quarter of the length of a standard book. And how much in depth do you want me to go with the writing and publishing process of this one?
I think what you've said so far is pretty
Okay, great.
awesome.
Because otherwise I'll just talk for the whole hour.
That's fine. So another question that we want to ask you was that quite often, as people who write stories, especially as a young audience, we find it hard to write, think of ideas. How do you think of your own story ideas and where do you get your creativity from?
Sure. I'm glad you asked me this because I wrote like an essay on this very recently. So the way I think about ideas is that our brains are an attic, and in that attic are posters of every movie we've watched, every book we've read, every conversation we've had with our friends, every thought we've ever entertained, and they're all in this attic up there. So you can kind of imagine, like, this is a good representation of this wall over here with lots of things stuck on it. And in this attic of our mind, sometimes when we're up there, we accidentally tear a poster. So we might tear the poster in half, and then there's a poster hidden behind that because we've got so much stuff stored up there. And then what you kind of have is 2 posters, which, for whatever reason, when one is torn, you can sort of create a completely new thing out of the way that they both combine together. In much the same way that you might have like a collage, where you're just sticking a bunch of random stuff onto a paper. When your ideas kind of combine with each other, I find, for me personally, that's how a lot of my stories evolve. They might come from thinking about the intersection of different things, and then thinking about, oh, if I took this ingredient and I took this ingredient here, and I combine them into one thing, that would be new. And a really good exercise that you can do to do this on a more practical level is a thing that I do with some of my writing friends occasionally, where we each contribute one storytelling idea. So my idea might be like carrots, Melvin's might be chairs, yours might be a blue shirt. And we have these 3 ideas, and then we have to try to combine these 3 ideas into a story. And this exercise, it sounds kind of weird, but I found that pretty much every time we've done it, we end up with a really cool story within half an hour. And that's simply because you're just combining all these different ingredients together and creating this kind of soup out of them. So in terms of getting lots of ideas, the key is just, I think, reading a lot, living a lot, like trying a lot of new things, and then not being afraid to daydream as well. I think as you get older, like sometimes daydreaming can have like a negative association as like something that you do if you're lazy or whatever. But I've actually found that it's probably like one of the most important things to try to create lots of in your own life. So hold on to that for sure. And then in terms of actually taking the idea and turning it into a story, I think for me that's the most interesting part because ultimately ideas are a bit cheap. It doesn't matter how good your idea is. What really matters is how good you can turn it into a story. So you can really take any kind of idea and create an interesting narrative out of it. So I would encourage you to think about it less as a question of how can I have a good idea and more in terms of how can I take what I'm thinking of and turn it into a story.
Perfect. One other question I'm going to ask you was, so recently, as a tutor, what I've done is I've bought them 200 books, this huge pile of books, and we made this library sort of thing.
That's awesome.
And yeah, so they've been borrowing it and they're reading from it. So quickly, could you just read out, like, say some of the books that you've been borrowed from us, and then like suggest become an idea. So yes, I want to tell you.
The White Tiger.
White Tiger. What about you, Naman?
The Secret River.
Secret River. What about you? What books do you guys have there?
The Dirt.
Jet music, so a lot of Tim Winton books and that sort of thing. So what we found from the students is that the students found it a bit boring. But the reason I bought such difficult books, more high school level sort of or young adult books, is because of the complexity of the maturity of ideas compared to an author like David Values. So how would you suggest any books that can be both interesting but also have mature and complex ideas? And if not, how can we make it easier or more fun to read these older level books?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always fall on the side of like read what interests you and what is going to get you reading and get you engaged in it. So, well, I think it's great that you like try to digest books that might be like a bit more quote advanced, which is certainly a good idea. I think it's also important to just be reading the things that you are like really enjoying with that. Books that I really enjoyed when I was around, you're all about 10 or so, am I correct? Okay, cool. So, books I would recommend for that, I mean, if you haven't read Harry Potter, like, has anyone not read Harry Potter yet? Really? Wow! Get onto it. Harry Potter's amazing. I think, like, the reason why I suggest Harry Potter is because, yes, it is accessible at, like, a younger age or whatever, but it's still something that I've come back to and have continually reread and got new ideas from it. So I would certainly suggest Harry Potter, and even if you read it before, I always have found it valuable to go back, and I've probably reread the series probably about 7 times or so at this stage, and every time there's always been something new. So I would definitely recommend Harry Potter. What are some other good books? I like The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. He's quite a good writer as well. And I think what I like about him is that he writes like children's stuff, but he doesn't necessarily like talk down to his audience, which I don't know, like going back and rereading some books that I really enjoyed when I was younger, I kind of felt like they were a bit condescending almost, in the sense of like things were simplified because the author thought that you weren't smart enough to take it in, and like we all know that you are smart enough to take it in. You probably are reading things that are above what adults would assume you are able to read. So we got this up there. Harry Potter, yeah, Harry Potter's great. Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. What are some other good ones? I might have to sit with this for a bit. Can I send through a list to you? Yeah, I'll send through a list to you after this, because there are definitely a lot. But yeah, like if you haven't read Harry Potter, definitely check that out. Skyrocket Pleasant by Derek Landy as well. It's a good one. I would certainly recommend that. That's a series that, like Harry Potter, sort of starts you up and then ages up as you go along. Yeah?
Didn't you say this diary book? Because I was messaging you on YouTube, you said about the diary, like one diary book.
Diary book. Was it, like me the name, Flowers for Algernon?
I think it was like that something.
It was something like that? Yeah, Flowers for Algernon. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'll send through a list of this afterwards, but yeah, I would definitely recommend it. I think the biggest thing is just like not being afraid to read whatever you want to read. So like whether it looks like it's too young for you or whether it looks like it's too old for you, if it's something that you're interested in, just go for it, because like I will still read books that like might be considered too young for me, and like when I was your age, I would read books that were considered too old for me. So yeah, don't feel restricted by that. Yeah.
Which books do you read like right now?
What do I read right now? That's a really good question. So I'll give you my like 3 top authors at the moment. So the first one is Brandon Sanderson. It's just like big, epic fantasy stuff. The books are doorstoppers. They're like this big. So they're massive, but they're very worth it. The second one is Joe Abercrombie, also fantasy. I read a lot of fantasy stuff because like that's what I write, and that's the thing that I enjoy the most and I'm most passionate about. And then probably the third one, would be good for you, is Gabriel Berg-Moser, who has been like sort of a mentor to me. So like there's a bit of bias in me recommending him, but he has written a really good trilogy called the Boone Shepherd trilogy, which I might have recommended last time. And he's also written some, he is writing some older stuff which will come out soon. So I've been reading like a bit of his unpublished stuff to give feedback on it and stuff. So yeah, I would probably say the big authors for me at the moment, Brandon Sanderson, Joe Abercrombie, Gabriel Berg-Moser, and yeah, those are probably the main ones. But if you're familiar with my podcast, you will probably have like heard some of those names before, because those are the people that I really enjoy, so I talk about it a lot. Yeah.
What got you engaged with story writing?
What was the question again, sir?
What got you engaged with story writing?
Oh, I think it's just a creativity. The first thing I ever wrote was Pokemon fanfiction, because I was like, me and my friend are going to make our own Pokemon game, so we better have a book for it. And then from that moment, I just really enjoyed the creative aspect of it, and I guess the ability to sort of just make a world from scratch and just explore what life is like in it. Yeah.
So just another just extension of that question from before. It was, why do we read books? As what's the whole purpose of it? Why can't we just watch movies, or why can't we play games? Why do we read books?
Great question for that. If there was like a box for me to stand on here, I would get on my pulpit and preach about it. So movies and books are fundamentally different. There's not one that is necessarily better than the other, but you've got to understand that they are creating different things. So, right now you're looking at me, right? And you're all going to see me in more or less the same way. You know, I've got 2 arms, I'm wearing glasses, I have long pants on. Like, there's not much room for debate within that. But if you're reading about this scene in a book, you will all see me in different ways, because the book might describe how Jed is standing at the front of the classroom with a microphone. And you will all have a different interpretation of how that looks. You will all think, okay, maybe he's this high, or maybe he's like waving his arms around a lot, or maybe he's like not waving his arms around a lot. And you will all have different interpretations of the story, and through doing that, you're all creating the story. So in a book, you aren't getting the story delivered to you. You and the author are actually equal partners in this, and you're working together to experience what's happening in the plot. So, for that reason, books tend to engage different parts of your mind, because they are forcing you to come up with a story as you are experiencing it. Whereas a movie, while amazing and while it can access sound, which is something that books don't really have to access, and while it can do visual stuff a lot more easily than a book, it's less good at kind of engaging the internal stuff that goes on. It's less good at engaging your imagination, and it's more prescriptive. There was a quote from John Fowles, which I think goes like, in a movie, if a girl walks across the street, we all see the same girl walking across the same street, but in a book, there's a million different girls walking across a million different streets, and that's because you are all creating that in your mind. Yep.
How do you write good stories? What makes you get a good story?
Do you want me to answer that now? We're going to touch upon that.
Yeah, sure.
I can answer now. Yeah, so I think the most important thing is, are you enjoying telling the story? Is it something that's engaging you as you are writing it? Is it something that you can't wait to get a quiet chance to put pen to paper and to explore it? And then beyond that, I think it comes down to, I can talk about the craft of what makes a good story all day, but I think the key things for me are conflict, making sure there's something happening, caring for the main characters, making sure that your readers are actually invested in the main characters' their goals, and they want the characters to succeed or they want them to fail. And I guess probably the simplest way to boil down what makes a good story, because like this is something I could talk about for hours, and I have before, but there was a really good quote I read from Ray Bradbury recently, and he said that good storytelling is simply about finding a character like you or like someone else or just completely imaginary, and then finding out what do you love, what do you hate, what does this character love and hate, and then just setting them loose in the pursuit of whatever they love or whatever they hate, and following them and just seeing like, what are you going to do? So I think, yeah, if you were kind of to boil down like the one biggest thing that creates a good story, I would say it's strong goals for your character, and from that, everything else should flow out pretty naturally. That's a good question.
So one of the main reasons that we focus on reading books is because we can, read a dictionary and then spend a whole summer reading a dictionary and memorizing words, or we can read books. We can get multiple grammar books and then learn about the different grammar rules of English and then study for years on end. Or we can read a book. We could look at different ideas. We can contemplate, philosophize different ideas and listen to different stories from other people. When we think about different stories, or we can read a book. So the reason we found that reading a book is that it helps address these three issues of learning grammar, spelling, and other sort of things, improving our vocabulary, and also improving our creativity by reading books. So the question we have is, do we need to read books, or could we read short stories or other mediums, or would they be just as effective as reading a book, or do you feel that reading a book is better to improve those specific skills?
Yeah, okay, so to improve vocabulary, what were the other ones? Grammar, spelling. Okay, so to kind of improve like your literacy and writing abilities, is it worthwhile reading long things versus could you just get 10 from a short story? I definitely think like to your earlier point, like fiction is super critical to read, and a lot of people might think, well, fiction, it's not real, like what's the point in reading it? And again, to quote Ray Bradbury, who I have read a really good book by him recently, he describes fiction as similar to, okay, I'm going to have to back up and give you some Greek mythology here, but I'm sure you'll enjoy this. So in Greek mythology, there's a creature called the Gorgon, and if you look at the Gorgon with your bare eyes, you turn to stone. So you don't want to look at the Gorgon with your bare eyes. So, what's that? Yeah, Medusa. Medusa is like one of the Gorgons, so good to see you got that reference. So the way that this creature is defeated in traditional Greek mythology is one of the characters basically uses his sword as a shield. So he like sneaks up on Medusa and looks at the reflection of her in the shield, and as a result he's able to get to her without going to stone. So fiction is that shield. It's a way of pretending that you're not looking at the world in order so that you can look at the world and solve problems in the world. So for instance, like a lot of science fiction books do this. They fool you into thinking they're not real and that they're just set in an imaginary world. But really, the things that they're exploring throughout how they have the technology in the world, throughout how they have society set up, they're all commenting on the world we're living in today, and we're all learning from that. So that's why fiction is quite valuable, because it gives you that sort of outside perspective to look back in on life. In terms of how you can benefit the most from stories, I don't know, I guess the benefit of, if you were looking at just short stories as a means to improve grammar and stuff, you would get a probably bigger understanding, because you could go through like 12 different stories and you could see 12 different ways that authors have used grammar and or like have structured the plot and everything. But I do think there is something to be said for sticking with something that's a bit longer, and maybe this is just unbiased because like I write long stuff, but the reason why novels are quite valuable is because they give you more of a sense of the journey of something. So if you are trying to learn how to tell more compelling stories, I would recommend novels, even though the majority of what you're probably going to write in a class is a short story. But if you're just purely interested in like sampling, I suppose, bite-sized pieces of this is like one way you can write a story, or this is another way to write a story, then yeah, short stories are probably going to give you like more of a sample size, even if that sample size is a bit shallower. So yeah, I guess it depends. Like, do you want to go broad but not very deep, or do you want to go deep but not very broad? And probably for purposes of like classroom discussion and stuff, I would recommend short stories just because it's like feasible for you to say, read this short story, you've got 10 minutes now, everyone can read it, and then we can all talk about it as a class.
Awesome. Now let's go more into structure of the story. So one of the questions that we constantly had was, we went through narrative structure quite a bit in the class, and one of the aspects of narrative structure that we always confused was falling action. So could you tell us what falling action really is and how we should learn about it in stories?
Cool. So, who watches sports? Yep. Great. So, at the end of the sporting match, one team has won, one team has lost. What generally happens next? Yep. Yeah, they declare the winners. Yeah, and then like what happens afterwards? Yeah.
They like ask the players how they felt about the match.
Bingo, you've got it. So, falling action is a bit like the post-game press conference in a sporting event. So you've had the exciting stuff, you've had the players out in the field, you know, one team has won, one team has lost, and then as the players are done and they're like heading back to the change rooms, you might have a commentator with a microphone like my own here come up to one of the players and be like, hey, like, what did you feel about that game? How did you think your performance went? Like, just tell me how that was. And in the same way as it's nice to have that sort of debriefing after a sporting event, it's nice to have that story as well. If you just cut the story at the point where the climax ends, so like when the main problem with the story is done, it's sort of the equivalent of just like the game finishes and then that's it, like the TV goes to black. And some people might want that, but it's always more satisfying for me at least if you have a bit of an opportunity to kind of debrief afterwards and just let the characters reflect on their new state of life. So I think this is the biggest thing because stories are really all about change. And if you don't have enough time at the end of the story to sort of decompress, you might be left wondering like how the character has changed. So to kind of like summarize what I've just said there, essentially the falling action is like the last couple of pages of your book. Normally it's like no more than, you know, like a chapter, you know, 10 to 20 pages or something like that. And this is just an opportunity for you to enjoy the story again after the tension that has happened throughout it. I think last time we did that story structure thing, I might have like drawn a graph about tension and stuff, about how you obviously want it to be going up, and then the climax is the highest point, and you don't really want to stop at the highest point, because then there's no really easily accessible way for the readers to get down. You want to kind of smooth it out by having a falling, kind of like a falling experience of tension. So like, you've had this really tense moment up here, and then it's like, oh, we can relax now. Like, oh, let's go back to our home. And you don't want it to drag out for too long, but it's always nice to have an opportunity to, much like the post-game sporting interview or whatever, it's a chance for you to just see how the characters have reacted to what's happened to them, how they've learned from what's happened to them, and how they have potentially changed as people. Any questions about one?
Okay, so basically most of us are here to learn how to prepare ourselves for the game exam, which is basically you have to write a story based on a prompt. You write a story, poem, any sort of piece of like text. And they have 30 minutes, which includes their reading time and the flying or something. So how would you recommend, first of all, let's just start with how would you recommend splitting up the amount of time you allocate to planning and to writing?
So just to confirm, you have 30 minutes to write like a short story or something? Yeah, they give you like one sentence prompt or something?
Yes, you have a picture, you have a one sentence prompt, you have a word prompt, that sort of thing. So last year's prompt was an image of a keyboard, and it said the word vote on the enter key, just in relation to the political climate of the federal elections at that time. And the years before was a picture of keys. So they have different images that need to write based on that.
Great. So this is really cool because they've given you some word association prompts to begin with. So like, as I was talking about earlier with that idea of myself and 2 friends, each contributing one idea to a story, and then us all sort of mixing this and going away and writing our own thing. You can sort of take that own approach to this. So, if you've only got, how many prompts do you have? 2 prompts?
Just one.
Just one prompt, and it's like,
That's
is
it.
there a
So
word?
it's just an image.
Okay, great. So yeah, like a couple of thoughts on this. The first is that whatever is the first thing that pops into your mind is probably going to be the thing that interests you the most, and the thing that you should consider pursuing. So when you look at the picture, like whatever the first thing is that you see, just like write it down immediately, because I often find that if I have an idea, I have like a big notebook and I just write down whatever I'm thinking in that. And even if I think that I've only got like 1 sentence worth of idea, inevitably it turns into like pages and pages of ideas just through the physical process of like your hand moving the pen over the paper. For whatever reason, that tends to just create a lot of things out of nothing. So it's very important that you put the pen to paper like as soon as possible, as soon as that starts, as soon as you start getting even an idea that you think might be silly, just start like jotting down a brief plan at the start, even if you think that it's not going to go anywhere. So that's the first piece of advice with that. Consider how you can just like start planning immediately, start getting dot points down. The second thing is that if you don't feel amazingly creative in that moment, maybe you need to add more ingredients. Maybe you can look around the room and pick your own second and third prop. And what this will do is it's going to give you more material to kind of draw your story from. So if you are like trying to cook something and you only have eggs, you're probably like pretty limited with what you can cook, right? Like you can do an omelette, you can do scrambled eggs, that's it. But if you have a bunch of other ingredients that you just like grab out of the pantry, then you can do so many other things, right? You have the potential to do way more interesting dishes. So it's the same with your story. If you just load yourself with one idea, it might mean your story's a bit flat. If you give yourself more ideas, then you're going to be more likely to come up with something interesting. So that's kind of the main crux of my advice for that. In terms of how you would split up your time for it, I would recommend maybe like 5 minutes planning, 25 minutes writing. Planning can seem like it's a waste of time, but in my personal experience, I've found that the planning is always going to make the writing faster because you know what's happening, you know what your characters are going to do, and that means that if you plan correctly, you have finished your story in the 5 minutes it took you to plan because now you know everything that happens, and now you're just writing down what happens. And as a result, it's going to be significantly easier for all of you. So the other thing to consider as well is like you want to just jot down thoughts about like, who a character is and what they want. And I think if you have those 2 things, like who a character is, what they want, combined with whatever your prompt is giving you, that should give you enough to go away with. So I think, like as with everything, the biggest thing is just practicing for this. So if you can find like past exams, or if you can just even Google writing prompt images and just try to like plan out a story for that in 10 minutes or whatever, that's really going to stand you in good stead for that.
So for the gay test, it says that unlike NAPLA and most of the other like English assessments, the main skill that they're looking for is not your spelling, grammar, and that sort of thing, which is your rules, but rather your ability to think creatively.
Yep.
So one of the advice I gave my students was that to not write the first thing that comes to your mind. Because the first thing that comes to your mind is quite when you have 6,000 students on the same image, it's quite often that most of the students will have the same sort of idea. And to be creative often means to be different. So how would you take your advice of taking the first thing that comes to your mind and the merit of it, which is to get started, and combine that with the needed skill of creativity?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So like I mentioned with my advice, it's not necessarily not necessarily writing the first thing that came to your mind, but the point is to whatever you think first, like start planning based on that. And you can, from that point, obviously come up with different things, completely different story ideas. But the crux of that is just getting some initial ideas down on paper so that you're overcoming that blank paper syndrome and you are starting the process of being creative. And then inevitably, new things will come up as you move forward. So in terms of like trying to write something that is highly creative and probably unlike what the 6,000 other students are producing, that thing that I mentioned before about giving yourself extra prompts can be really useful because it means that you're working with tools that all the other students don't have. If they're only writing with one prompt and you can generate 2 other prompts just looking around the room thinking like, okay, a projector and the number 4, and now you have 2 other ingredients that no one else is cooking with. And what that means is that you are inevitably going to come up with something creative if you can use all of those things. The other thing that I find really interesting as well from a trying to create something that's really original perspective is just constantly asking yourself, what if the opposite happened? So with characters, this is a really fun thing to ask. Just find one of your characters and ask, what would this character never do? And then make them do that. One of my favourite authors, Brent Weeks, he did this thing with with the novel he wrote. His agent encouraged him to try to think outside the box a bit, try to be more creative with his character, and he as a result he went away and asked that question: what would my character never do? And then he realised, oh, that's perfect. Like if the character did this, it creates such a unique story. It creates something that is way more original than if I just go on my first idea. So use that tactic of asking what would this person never do, and you can flip your story on the head. And yeah, I think the big thing is if you can kind of draw from different sources that aren't on the page, then you are inevitably going to create something that is different to what most other people are doing.
Awesome. So just to touch upon the question on characterization is, how can we create good characters and also create characters that have substantial reality to them, I guess. So characters that sound realistic.
Great question. So to create good characters, you have to kind of think about what is interesting with interesting people in real life. So is someone massively interesting if when you ask them, what is your favorite thing in the world, they just say, oh, I don't really know. Is that as interesting as a different person who you ask them and they say, oh, I really love rock climbing, I'm in the rock climbing gym 20 hours a week, I really like it. My hands are super chalky from all the climbing I do. Which one of those 2 people is more interesting to talk to? Rock climbing guy, exactly. So, I think about this guy just came from rock climbing, so Jimmy plugged for rock climbing, good times. When your character has a strong goal or strong motivations, that's how you get a strong character. Because if your character doesn't really want anything, then it's going to be hard for you to follow her around in the story and to actually get them to do stuff. So probably the number one thing for a really compelling character is a really strong goal. Whether that is a massive goal I want to save the world, whether that's a smaller goal I want to make sure that my 2-year-old has the best second birthday on the planet, whatever the goal is, if you make it really strong for a character and you commit yourself to just following and seeing what that character does, you're going to produce an interesting story. So that first thing is having a strong goal or motivation. The second thing is contradiction. So I might have used this example when I talked here before, but I'll give it again. So let's say that there is a character who, we'll call them Bob, just for reference, and Bob works at a puppy factory, and Bob really loves the puppies there. He's patting them all day, he's showering them, just taking care of his puppies. So Bob, really great puppies, at a puppy factory. Then let's imagine that Bob goes home and he doesn't have a puppy, or he does have a puppy, and it's really malnourished, and it's clear that Bob doesn't really care for that puppy. Now we have a really interesting character, maybe not a very nice character, but we have an interesting character because they're behaving one way, in one specific location, in one set of circumstances, and in the other way, they're a completely different person. So that's how you get contradiction, and you can weave this throughout a lot of different levels in your story. So, for example, if a character is half human, half robot, that's a contradiction. That creates interesting dimensions to the character. And Melvin mentioned that the idea was about having 3-dimensional characters, and this is how you create 3-dimensional characters. You add different layers of dimension to them by figuring out how they are different people in different circumstances. The last kind of, I guess, big thing with a character is considering their backstory. So this was something that I wasn't amazing with when I first started writing, but I'd like to think I've improved with it. And if you want to create a character that feels realistic, it's going to be hard to do that if you can't convince readers that they have existed before the story started. So obviously we both know that the characters in your story, they've just been created for this story, unless you've written something else and you're bringing it in. What you want readers to do is to think that they have enough richness to their life, enough interesting things that have gone on in their past, so that you can fool readers into thinking that this character is existing outside of this story, and that this story is just this little fraction of what the characters are experiencing. So ask yourself, what has this character done before? Like, what has been the important things that has happened in its past? What has been their favourite day? What has been their worst day? Like, what has been the best thing they've done for someone else? What's been the worst thing they've done to someone else? And if you add some of this hinting to readers that characters have existed outside of the story, and that they've been around before the story begins, and they will continue to be around after the story ends, unless they die, that's going to create really interesting characters. So yeah, the three things were, strong goals, using contradiction to create complexity and dimensions, and then the last thing was, creating a character that feels alive before and after the story.
Awesome. The next thing we want to ask you is, so just touching upon what you just talked about, how, thinking about creating a character with a backstory and that sort of thing. In our environment, which is 30 minutes of time doesn't do it, right? So, as an author, you probably have, all the time in the world to write your story, but since we have only 30 minutes, how can we find a balance between quickly putting out story ideas versus developing a really good character?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I appreciate you bringing it back to the context of 30 minutes for the story, because obviously, in a book, I have a bit more time to plan out everything. So I think it comes back to that idea about goals. So once you know what the character's goal is, ask yourself why he or she wants that. Why do they want to achieve this thing? And then as a result of that, you're going to understand what's happened in their past. So let's say that your character is Melvin. Melvin, we'll use you as an example. So Melvin really wants to create like an amazing tutoring experience for all of you, right? Melvin really wants to do that. And why does Melvin want to do it? Well, this is what you can ask yourself, right? And maybe you can brainstorm some different ideas. Maybe Melvin really wishes that he had like this cool tutoring environment when he was a kid. And I don't know any of these things, so I'm not necessarily confirming or denying any stories about Melvin here, but maybe he just really enjoys teaching because he loves communicating ideas from his head into yours. And what you can see that we've done there is that we've taken the character's goal, we've taken the what that the character wants to achieve, and then we've asked why. Why do you want to achieve this? What's in it for you? What is this going to give to you and your life and to your identity that won't be there if you fail to achieve this goal? So, for 30 minutes for a story, you might not be able to cover that in amazing depth, but you can ask yourself really quickly, why does my character want to climb to the top of the mountain? Why do they want to put on the best pageant for their country town? And then, once you know that, you don't have to go into a massive backstory, you don't have to go into a massive explaining scenes as to why the character wants this to happen. You can just drop like a little hint, and just a few subtle things will make a world of difference. If it's, say, a character who wants to achieve a sporting goal, maybe the character could think in their head, oh, like, I really hope I don't fail again this time. And then instantly you have this idea that the character has existed before the story, that they maybe have tried this before, and that maybe their past failings are their motivation for why they want to win the 100-meter race. Something like that.
Awesome, thank you. Next thing we wanted to ask you was, in terms of like planning things before you come into the exam room. So one thing that we were going to discuss in our next week's class was creating a calculus inside our head. So, I forgot the name of it, but developing 52 questions and creating an imaginary friend that goes with you and then taking a friend and then putting them into a situation for your story. So what do you think about writing pre-planned stories, or pre-writing stories for your test, or pre-writing characters and pre-writing conflicts and then trying to incorporate them? Or do you think that by doing so you might not have cogency in your story?
Sure. So do I think that by having aspects of your story pre-planned when you bring it in, will that improve the story? So I think for characters, this is a really great way to think about it. Because you're all probably familiar with like the idea of a book series, right? And you have probably continuing characters in them. Harry Potter is in all the Harry Potter books, big surprise. What's really useful about that approach, and I do like the idea of this, it's definitely something that you should experiment with, is in creating a character and then perhaps an attached world for that character that is interesting enough and flexible enough for you to take that into any situation and sort of view what you're writing in this particular test as like one installment in this character's adventures. So I would totally recommend that idea. I think that's a great move, Melvin, to have a character who you can kind of understand quite well and who can be thrown into sort of any situation and be interesting and have unique goals and different, I guess, interactions with the world in that story. So one example and then a tool that you can use to achieve this. So if you look at characters who are effectively doing this at the moment, you can look at people like James Bond. He's more or less the same in every story. You can kind of throw him into any situation and it will probably be interesting. You sort of know what the stories are all going to be about, but depending on what environment he's thrown into, always going to be fairly interesting. Characters like Indiana Jones as well. Hand up for everyone who's watched Indiana Jones. Only you? Really? Oh, 2 people. Great. I love Indiana Jones. I'm so devastated by that. Okay, so he's... I won't even explain. Anyway, it's good. Go watch Indiana Jones. What's useful about these characters is that their stories are very serialized. So you can take them and put them in sort of any situation and they'll probably be interesting there. So the tool that I mentioned that can be useful to this, and you'll definitely want to write this down, Scribe. Indiana Jones is one.
No.
So,
Eric wrote Indiana Jones.
Great. So this is something that you definitely want to write down, lovely Scribe, is the idea of the... You mind? Cool. So the idea of the premise, that's number one. And then the next one is designing principle. Man, I put you under a lot of pressure here, haven't I? This is cool. Okay, so what's the premise? What's the designing principle? So the premise is Luke Skywalker has to blow up the Death Star before it blows up the planet. So it's the plot. It's what's happening in your story. It's the thing that changes with every story, right? So you are having different types of conflict that are expressed in this plot. Designing principle is the way the story is told and the specific details of it. So actually, sorry, I got it the wrong way around. So the premise is what is changing in every story. What is staying the same in every story. And the designing principle is what is changing in every story. So with a continuing character, one useful tool to consider when you're writing them, and this can obviously change, is to have the same premise in every story, but a different designing principle. So if we think about James Bond, everyone familiar with James Bond, roughly? Yep, everyone put up your hands so that I can tell if you are familiar with. Cool, so James Bond, super spy, goes around spying on things, blowing things up, driving cars. So the premise for every James Bond movie is more or less the same, in that the plot is more or less the same. James Bond is attacked by some rich billionaire who's an evil genius who wants to destroy the world or whatever. James Bond has to stop that. The designing principle, on the other hand, is the thing that's changing. So you might have one James Bond story which is set in a casino. Then you might have another James Bond story which is set on the moon. Then you might have another one that's set on some really cool islands in the middle of nowhere. Maybe some volcanoes. And what you can see there is that you already know what the story's going to be about. Super spy tries to solve problems using spy skills, blows things up, drives fast cars, defeats evil genius. But the premise the designing principle is changing. There's different ways that this character is doing their thing. So you can think about this with your own characters. So let's say that our character again, for lack of better reference here, Melvin, you are our character. Your premise, so let's say we're going to do a series about Melvin's life. His premise here is that he is going to take students who don't understand something and he's going to help them understand something. That's what he's going to do in every single Melvin Strikes story. The designing principle is going to be different. So in one story, Melvin might be teaching you how to do English better. In another story, he might be teaching you how to kick a ball better. In another story, he might be teaching you how to make a chair or something. I can imagine you teaching all of these things. You're very talented. So what we can see here is that we always know what the Melvin story is going to be about. We always know it's going to be about him teaching someone to do something. But the specific thing that he's teaching is going to be different every time. So that's one way that you can think about your characters, right? So whatever character interests you and whatever character you want to develop, once you sort of know what they're well suited to, you already know what the story is going to be about. So if your character is, a spy, kind of like James Bond again, and your prompt is he's a typewriter, you already know that your story is going to be about this typewriter being used in some spy thing, and you just go from there. So that's one interesting tool that you can use to kind of pre-plan without necessarily being too restrictive, which I think is the big difficulty with that approach. But I would definitely recommend think about some characters that interest you and how you can write continuing stories about them.
Awesome.
I think I did that exact same approach in a bunch of primary school assignments as well. It's I'm just going to write these one set of characters, and then in every assignment I'll write a different adventure that they're doing. So thank you for helping me remember that.
Okay. One of the questions that we were going to ask you was, so we discussed this concept of first impression being the best impression you can have on your marker. So, in the relation between a student and a marker, you're not exactly meeting them, but rather they're knowing about you through your stories. So what I told my students was that because the first impression they get you is through your first paragraph, I told them that if you put a lot of detail into describing your setting in your exposition and a lot of detail into explaining your characters, it makes it look like you're a strong writer. And even if your writing ability fades throughout the story, the marker might dismiss it because of a lack of time. Do you agree with that statement? And if you do disagree, how can we restructure that thought?
Yeah, I totally agree. It doesn't change when you have an actual book. The first page is what's going to determine whether someone keeps reading or stops reading, whether they think you're good or bad. So I think you want to try to hook your marker as early as possible. So to hook them, one way that you can do that is absolutely by having detailed descriptions, detailed characterization and stuff. But I think the most effective way to hook someone in a short story context, where you only have half an hour to get your point across, is to try to immediately establish your character and what he or she wants. So again, it comes back to goals, right? So within the first, 3 paragraphs of your story, I should have a pretty good idea of what your character wants and what she is after. And if you can read the first 3 paragraphs of your story and not know what your character is after, that's a big warning sign for markets, because they will be wondering, what is this story about? Is the character ever going to want something? Are they ever going to try to have a goal here? And if they are unsure by those first 3 paragraphs, then they're probably going to assume that you are a weak writer moving forward. Whereas if you can have strong first 3 paragraphs, they're going to assume you're a strong writer moving forward. I would totally agree with Melvin. First impressions are not everything, but they are a lot of the puzzle when it comes to writing a good story. So what you really want to do is establish the character's goals, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you start your story with a lot of action and explosions or whatever, but it does mean that you have a very clear idea of what your character wants starting off. So with our Melvin story, the story might begin with Melvin running through the rain to reach this classroom because he was delayed because his car blew up or something, and that. I'd said no explosions and I put one in. But it just shows how desperate he is to get here, and so even though you don't necessarily know what he wants yet, you know that he wants something, and as a result, you're probably going to get an interesting story. And then you can have, paragraph 3, he finally gets into the classroom, and we establish how much he is really eager to come here and tutor all of you.
Awesome, thank you for the continuous.
Just giving you so many plugs there, Tom.
Another thing we want to ask you was, about setting as well. So you talked about we talked about earlier about pre-planning our characters. Can we do the same thing with our settings? Can we pre-plan our settings?
Yeah, I don't think there's any aspect of your story that you can't pre-plan, especially if we are doing this idea of creating a consistent world to write in, and then just having different installments in this series following your character into different situations. Yeah, absolutely, settings can be pre-planned. Settings are probably the easiest thing to pre-plan, because you can, have like a couple of different worlds in your back pocket. Like maybe you've got one world which is like your space world, and there's like people in spaceships that fly around, and laser guns and cool stuff, and that's a setting that you can just quite easily brainstorm in your own time and then bring into any story you want. Maybe you have a couple of different set pieces within your own world where you will maybe draw from inspiration, so like maybe this classroom, maybe your home, maybe your school. Like these are places where you can quite easily draw from and use them in that sort of pre-planned way in the story. But yeah, definitely, I don't think there's any story element that you can't sort of brainstorm ahead of time leading into your story.
Awesome.
Who wants the PowerPoint?
Oh, we're bringing it up, but just want to ask you guys, do you guys have any questions that you guys want to ask that I haven't covered yet? There are a few more questions, but now that you've heard Judd speak a bit about the different questions so far, is there any new questions that you wanted to ask based on what you've heard so far? Any questions?
Yes.
What would you say is the main part of the story?
In like stories in general?
No, like what would you say would be like the most important part, depending on what type of writing piece it is?
That's a really good question. So what is the most important part of the story? I think it's characters. Characters are ultimately the thing that is going to connect with readers the most, and the thing that if you took away, if you took anything away from a story, it probably wouldn't work. But if you took characters away, it would have the worst impact on it. Because if you think back to, if you all think about like a story or a movie that you really love, what you probably really like about it are the characters, and in the story's ability to connect you with them, and to explore their lives, and to understand this person who is different from you. Because fundamentally, that's what stories are about, right? They're about letting you experience the world through a different pair of eyes, through a different person's experience, and experiencing that. Just see that in the background, and just seeing that experience in a different way to how you could possibly understand it. So yeah, I would probably say characters are the most important part, and that's why I really stress the importance of having strong goals for all of your characters. There's a very famous writing quote that's like, every character should have a goal for something, even if it's just them wanting to have a cup of water. Like, if all of your characters in the scene have a goal, you're inevitably going to have conflict, which creates plot, which is sort of the second most important thing. And then as a result of that plot, you're going to have them exploring the setting, and then you're going to have all of this other stuff, but it all feeds out, I think, fundamentally from character. Oh boy.
Look at him. He's speaking, not the TV screen.
The TV screen has a space.
Does it look the same as that face?
Right.
Uh,
Finally,
Look at the one with the markers moving, right? Okay, come on.
one last question we want to discuss was what's a good way to end a story? Because most of our students, especially through primary school, they do the classic, they do a cliffhanger, or they would and all agree and he woke up. Those are the things. So how can we end a story in a way that is fulfilling for the reader?
Sure. So again, comes back to characters and their goals. Does your character achieve the goal? Yes or no? Or perhaps they achieve some of it, but they fail to achieve the other stuff. So the natural place for your story to end is, let's show if the character succeeded or failed with their goal, and then let's show if the character is happy or sad or like disappointed or another emotion as a result of what has happened with their goal. So maybe a character really wanted something, and then they didn't get it, so they failed at their goal, but they got something else, and they are happy with what they ended up with, and that's a good natural point to end the story. So, or maybe they get what they want, and they're like happy and everything. So, the natural place to kind of end your story shouldn't be like a and then they woke up or just a random cliffhanger, because stories are all about plotting a character's progression and their change in their arc. So if a character starts in this place here, where they want to achieve something, the promise that you are making to everyone who's reading your story is that by the end of the story, you're going to find out if the character succeeded or failed with this, or if they gave up, or if their goal changed, or anything like that. Because really the promise you're giving as a storyteller is like, we're gonna be with this character for some of their life, and we're gonna see what they do, and we're gonna see if they achieve what they wanted to achieve or fail to achieve what they want to achieve.
Awesome. And now just a few questions I want to ask about your own like sort of personal like style of writing. Is why did you go into fantasy writing? And do you have any like suggestions as like on just that question. Why did you go into fantasy writing?
Sure. So is everyone familiar with what a fantasy story is? Is anyone not familiar? Okay, cool. I'll just define it anyway. So a fantasy story is like generally set in a world that has, different laws of nature to us. So in our world, we can't fly. In a fantasy story, maybe everyone can fly. So what really interests me about fantasy stories is that it just feels to me like an incredibly creative, genre of fiction, because there's literally no limit. Like, you don't have to conform to the laws of gravity if you don't want to. You don't have to have humans living on only one planet. You can have them like living in the sky. You can have them living in the ocean. You can do anything you want. So to me, it's just like an incredibly free mode of creative expression. It gives you a lot of responsibility with that as well, to create something that is interesting and that sort of makes sense within its own world. Fantasy sometimes gets like a lot of flack for being escapist or like just interested in entertaining, and kind of the storytelling equivalent of fairy floss, in that like, yeah, sure, it tastes good, but there's like no nutritional value to this. It's not actually good for you in the long term. And I couldn't disagree more. I think every story is about exposing you to like a different way of seeing the world, and fantasy stories do that to like the 10th billion degree, because they don't just show you a different way to see this world, but they might show you a different way to see like a different world as well, or use that different world to comment on our world as well. And I think it all comes back to that reference I gave before about how the only way to kind of slay the Medusa is to look at it through the reflected mirror of your bronze shield. And fantasy and science fiction as well is that bronze shield. It's a way of pretending to look away from the world so that you can actually see it more clearly through the rear view mirrors, through like stepping outside and looking through the telescope at it. So while it looks on the surface like fantasy books are escaping from the world, they're actually a really great way of engaging with the world. And asking yourself, hey, how would human society be different if everyone could like sneeze fireballs out of their nose? How would the human world be different if we were all riding giant crabs around? And like, these might seem weird questions to ask, but there's an opportunity, as there is in any genre of story, to use creativity and imagination in these kind of different worlds as a way to comment on the human experience and what it's like to live in our own world. And it's just fun. Like, it's just what I grew up reading. It's what I continue reading to this day. So it's sort of natural for me to continue with that. And like I said at the start of this, to bring it full circle, like, there is no one right genre to read. There is no like one right type of book to read. It's just whatever's interesting to you. And to me, that's fantasy.
Okay. And then lastly, just talking about genre, what's your thoughts about reading non-fiction books? For example, I picked up reading because I felt like it was kind of hypocritical that I'm not reading and I'm trying to read. So the books I've been reading recently is, as you can see here. So I'm reading Obama's autobiography or something. So would you suggest them to read fiction or non-fiction in order to improve those literacy skills and those creativity skills that I mentioned earlier?
I mean, like I've said a lot, just read everything, and you'll inevitably find the things that interest you the most. I think in order of like what type of stories you should be reading, it should be what are the stories that interest you and that you will be engaged with reading. Those are important. And then also like what are things that will push you and help you grow and develop. And yeah, I would definitely recommend non-fiction for that. For many years I didn't really read too much non-fiction, but there's a lot of interesting stuff in it. Even you know, as a fantasy author, I find it particularly useful to read history, because there is stuff that goes on in history that I could not possibly put in my book because people would think that it's too wild, like too made up, you know, too ridiculous, too violent, whatever. And it's like, no, this is something that actually happened, but it just seems absolutely outlandish, and sometimes, you know, truth can be less realistic than fiction. So yeah, I would definitely recommend non-fiction as well. I personally really enjoy reading non-fiction books about writing, so writing advice books, which I can give through a list of those as well. Those are really useful because you just get to hear from, you know, people who've been practicing writing great stories for, you know, 20, 30 years, and then they're just distilling all of their wisdom into one book, and from that you can, you know, learn a lot of stuff. So yeah, non-fiction, fiction, like poems, whatever, I guess that's technically fiction, like whatever interests you, whatever you think is like new, go for that, and yeah, definitely try to push yourself out of your comfort zone. There are genres that I haven't read that much in the past, and I'm sort of trying to read more of. But yeah, just whatever is interesting you, whatever's keeping you reading, I think is the main thing.
Awesome. And a final question was 2 months ago, September was a special month for you because that's when you first published your first book.
Yes.
So our last question is, can you convince us to buy your book?
Yeah, I can. So this is the book here. It is called Fires of the Dead. And it is a fantasy book. So it is set in a world where there are magicians who can draw energy from fires to make their own flames. So it's a kind of fairly original take on fire magic. And this specific book is about, is there something interesting? Yeah, there you go, there's a cover and there's more face. So it's about a group of thieves who are venturing into this haunted, desolate forest to try to recover this powerful magical artifact. They think the forest is deserted, as they quickly find the forest is not deserted, and there's lots of other people who are looking for this artifact as well, and calamity ensures from there. So it's very fast-paced. Like I mentioned, it's a novella, so it's the kind of thing that you can probably easily read in 2 to 3 hours, 1 to 2 sittings. If you want to see me talk about it in more depth, I was interviewed about it on a blog, so I can give a link to that as well. And there's been some really nice reviews on the Amazon page and stuff. And yeah, essentially, if you enjoy stories with magic, fast-paced plots, and interesting twists that are what you would maybe not expect, then you'll really love this book.
Okay, and where can we buy the book?
You can buy it on Amazon. Is probably the best spot to get it. You can get it from a couple of other online bookstores as well. It is not yet available in traditional retail bookstores, but if you go to your local library and you ask them to order it in, they should order it in for free, which is amazing because you get the book for free, but you don't have to pay for it, and I get money for it. What's so funny? It's
can you
having that? Been a long day. Yeah, so probably the best way to get it is through the Amazon page, and I'll give you links to that, and that can get shipped out to your place for free, or just go to your local library and ask them to order it in, and they should be able to order it in for free.
Awesome.
There's an audiobook as well, which is read by me.
Thank you very much for your time today, Jen.
Thanks, gentlemen. Thank you all for having me.